So my name is Justin Vozzo, as Chris mentioned. I'm an extension specialist in forestry with focus in arboriculture and urban forestry areas. I also have experience in ecological restoration and inventory. I am an ISA International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist with TRAC, which is Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. I'm also the current Illinois state coordinator for the Big Tree registry program that tracks champion trees across our state, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that program here in the presentation. Uh, my current favorite tree, if you guys have seen some of my presentations in the past, it currently is the chinkapin oak. In the past, I've said bur oak, and so I, realized that, things change, and right now it's the chinkapin oak. So here's to get us kicked off is a beautiful image in the center here of a several hundred-year-old chinkapin oak near Urbana, Illinois. So to get us started here, what exactly are legacy trees? What are we talking about when I use this term? For the purposes of this presentation and generally, legacy trees is a pretty broad term. It encompasses a lot of different categories or trees that we might also consider in other categories. But typically, these are trees that are going to be recognized for their significance in a in certain categories that I'll cover here. Often, these trees are what you might call survivor trees or lingering trees that have survived some kind of stand replacing event, whether that's due to a human disturbance like a logging event or a natural disturbance like an invasive species or potentially a wildfire. Many of the trees that we have in the landscape, are ones that have maybe individuals that have survived such an event and we still have here with us today. Some common attributes that we might think about for legacy trees, but this is kind of a non-exclusive list, just kind of general attributes. Many of these trees are either culturally or historically significant for some reason. They might have very old age, especially for the species or location. So it's important to remember that certain species of trees, may or may not just be longer lived than others, but also that within certain geographic locations, there might be kind of normal lifespans for those. These might also be extremely large specimens, again, for that specific species or location. They may be kind of advanced in their life stage. So, trees that have started a natural process of what we call retrenchment, and I'll give you some more information on that here in a second. And they may or may not have a high biological value associated with them due to their age and size. They're just really general here. And again, legacy trees and the purpose of this presentation is going to be fairly broad. There's also many synonyms or many other names that we might recognize such trees by. These include things like heritage trees. I think somebody in the chat has already mentioned a heritage tree in their location, which is great. And legacy and heritage trees are probably the two of the closest terms, but many of these others, including witness trees, veteran trees, champion trees, historic trees, landmark, specimen, or wolf trees all have similar types of connotations, although some of them may or may not be more specific and have, more specific meaning associated with it. Here's an example on the right here of the current Illinois state champion green ash, and you'll notice, as I mentioned, I'm the current coordinator of the Illinois Champion Tree Program. So you'll see several different examples and photos here in the presentation of some of our champion trees. Just wanted to highlight that. Some additional definitions I wanted to clarify before we get too far into the presentation. Again, covering this term of what we call retrenchment. Retrenchment is, again, a natural process that essentially means a shrinkage or a retreat of the canopy, and this can occur at various different life stages. It doesn't just happen at the final life stage within the tree's life. Trees, they may or may not go through periods of very beneficial environmental conditions, and then maybe a period of a drought or something that might lead to more of a natural retrenchment. And that's, again, something that happens at various life stages and is a normal process. Vigor, when we talk about vigor, refers to the overall growth efficiency that's inherent in a tree, and this is determined kind of by its genetic factors. So this is something that does not necessarily change over the course of a tree's lifetime. But a similar term, vitality, really is also describing kind of the growth condition or health of the tree, but this is more of a variable descriptor. So this vitality really can change based on external factors throughout that tree's life period. And here's our champion flowering dogwood. Yes, somebody mentioned a great dogwood in the chat. This is our current state champion, and this is a tree that you might consider going through natural retrenchment with some shrinkage of the canopy due to its old age. Similarly, we have senescence, which is the final developmental stage of a tree's life period. And this is again related to kind of more of the genetics or the vigor. This is kind of predetermined based on how long that tree can potentially live based on its genetics. And something similar, a similar term that we talk about a lot through our presentations and outreach is decline. But tree decline really refers to a reduction in size or potentially retrenchment that occurs before that maximum potential limit of size or age is reached. So this is again due to kind of external stressors that are affecting the tree. So in this image here, you see an example of oak decline, which is a really common problem we have across the state. Uh, so what is really, getting into kind of the benefits and significance of some of these legacy trees? What are the biggest parts and, you know, biggest reasons why we value these is their cultural significance. And so trees across many cultures are valued for, their as symbols of resilience and longevity. Um, they also are often icons in various stories that relate to people's values in a certain community. They also help us remember, ancestors or historical figures from the past, and they also help us establish a sense of place. So in many communities where we have these notable legacy trees, you'll see a strong connection and to the sense of place related to that tree. The trees themselves might also contain really valuable archaeological or historic information in their growth rings, which is a really interesting area of research as well. So a lot of things to consider as far as the cultural significance of trees. This tree on the right is our national champion sassafras. Unfortunately, it's not in Illinois, it's in Kentucky, in Daviess County, but this is a tree with an interesting story about, um, you know, a highway project at one point that was coming through to this town, and really the story gets back to a single woman who really stood and protected this tree from the developers. And the story goes that eventually she even faced the governor of Kentucky, who she somehow convinced to move the highway project in order to preserve this tree. So just one example of how, you know, our cultural heritage and our values might be represented in some of these stories. Aside from cultural values, there's also a lot of different measurable benefits that we gain from these legacy and other mature trees, including carbon assimilation. There's been research showing that these large trees um, of a species can actually, add on the same amount of carbon in a single year as a medium-sized tree of that same species might do in up until its entire lifetime, which is very interesting. And obviously that varies a lot depending on species and specific context, but just shows you kind of the impressive scale that some of these massive legacy trees can achieve. They also help us by increasing property values, reducing our energy bills, and you know, increasing stormwater runoff. Like this image here on the right shows these legacy trees as part of a rain garden. There are certain tools we can use, like this one I have listed here, iTree tools that helps us quantify and estimate some of these based on specific factors we can input about our own trees. And from last week's presentation, and perhaps one of the most important benefits we might gain from these trees is really their effect on human health outcomes. So if you didn't catch last week's webinar, I highly encourage you to go back onto our YouTube once we have it posted and check out the presentation from Dr. Donovan regarding human health outcomes in trees. There's also numerous ecological benefits of legacy trees. This is one that we like to talk about a lot here in our extension forestry webinars. Um, you know, trees provide a diverse range of habitats and varieties of habitats for these different flora and fauna within their deadwood, their cavities, especially, different textures within the bark. Um, and they provide a huge amount of food and other resources to many of our native flora and fauna. So keep this tree in mind right here. This is a mature uh, American beech tree that's actually located in Indiana that one of our researchers here on campus was studying. And keep this in mind, especially this large canopy here. And we'll talk about this again here in a second. So within that kind of scope, legacy trees support a variety of different flora and fauna. The first of those being fungi, starting on a smaller scale. Having symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi is really important for many trees. Um, especially though for legacy trees, these can help support trees into their old age, by improving soil conditions and essentially supplementing the roots and their ability to gather nutrients and water. But legacy trees also provide important habitat for different saprotrophic fungi, which are fungi that feed on decaying wood and other organic materials. So, we often might think of these as pests within our trees, but in some cases, you might be, providing habitat for rare types of fungi with your um, legacy trees. They also can provide habitat for epiphytic plants and microorganisms, things like mosses, lichens, algae, ferns, and other similar types of plants and microorganisms. These are often communities that take really long times to establish. So having a habitat like a legacy tree, which can be hundreds or thousands of years old, can be really important for these different types of organisms. And sometimes these can even be used as as indicators of habitat quality. Moving on to invertebrates. Invertebrates, essentially, we're talking about our insects, our um, other small wildlife, such as, beetles, ants, parasitoid wasps, termites. Um, Many of what we call saprophilic insects, they depend on dead and decaying woody material for a part of their life cycle, whether that's for food or for habitat for creating burrows and etc. There's all kinds of important habitat that can be established within our legacy trees, whether it's within a cavity or maybe a dead branch, and so that is an important resource for a lot of these different insects. There's also been studies showing that as tree diameter increases, we have increasing beetle diversity, within some of these saprophilic insect groups. So it can be a really important group. These are also potentially pollinators for many of our native plants and et cetera. So it is really important that we provide them with these deadwood resources in our legacy trees. We also have various cavity nesting birds here within Illinois, different woodpeckers, flickers, owls, even some warblers like the prothonotary warbler depend on dead and decaying woody materials and cavities within those trees. And so this is a really important resource for a lot of those. Here's an image of a barred owl chick inside of a cavity of an American beech. Uh, and many of these species can only essentially only use these types of cavities for their nests. We also have, last but not least, the mammals, many of which we're familiar with: the squirrels, possums, raccoons, skunks, mink, but especially one to note in this category is the bats. And a big part of that is within Illinois and within the Midwest, we have various state endangered, but also federally endangered bat species that rely heavily on these legacy trees and their associated cavities for habitat. Um, in Illinois, we have the Indiana bat, gray bat, and northern long-eared bat, which are all federally threatened or endangered. But we also have in total 13 bat species that all depend, or many of which depend on these cavity resources within legacy trees. That the tree I showed you that image of earlier that I told you to hang on to in your minds, there's been research done here at University of Illinois showing that similar trees as to that one can support colonies of up of north of 50 bats within a single cavity-bearing tree, similar to the one that I showed you earlier. So really, really important resource for these bats. There are, though, several different threats that we have to legacy trees, many of which we discuss, through various um, programs that we hold here with the Extension Forestry Group and other extension groups. A big one is development and land use change or construction activities around these trees is a big threat to many of those trees. Oftentimes, it's actually under the soil and the roots that are affected through these activities that causes long-lasting damage or irreparable damage. But of course, we also have changing climate conditions and associated extreme weather like tornadoes, derechos, lightning strikes, and flooding that can be a serious threat to many of these legacy trees. It only takes one uh, strong wind to potentially compromise a tree. And so that can be a huge risk. Also, invasive pests and diseases, which I'll talk to you about here in a little bit. And sadly, we do still face poaching and vandalism as threats to many of our legacy trees. And I've got I've got an example of that I'm going to share with you as well. And then lastly, improper tree management, really, it might not be intentional, but it can be a huge threat to some of our legacy trees. Just the way that the actions that we take to try and maintain them or not. So as I mentioned, changing climate conditions in the Midwest and Illinois, um, this increase in temperature that we're seeing is going to lead to increased temperature and precipitation, which can lead to more droughty conditions, hotter and drier summers, but then also more intense rain events. So, seeing within a single day, 2-inch rain events, that's been increasing over the past 120 years. And that can be detrimental with that rain, but also other associated um, components of the storm, such as straight line winds, otherwise known as derechos. So in 2020, we faced you know, a really impactful derecho here in the Midwest across Iowa and Illinois that caused over 11 billion in damages. And this has been, linked through what we call climate attribution science to this directly to increasing temperatures. Like I mentioned, there's also, a strong impact of invasive species. So in Illinois, especially over the past 100 years, we faced Dutch elm disease, which was an invasive fungal disease, and emerald ash borer is one that we are still dealing with in many of our communities across the state. Both of these are those, stand replacing types of natural events I described earlier. But we do have remaining trees on the landscape, legacy trees, or otherwise known as lingering trees, that can be really important sources of propagation materials for restoration efforts. So that is one thing to keep in mind. If you do find any large ash or elm trees on the landscape that have survived these different invasive species, they can be really important genetic pools that we can draw from and utilize for restoration efforts. So keep an eye out for those big ash and elm trees, especially. Like I mentioned, we are also still unfortunately dealing with poaching and vandalism to many of our legacy trees. This is an example that I wanted to include, because it was kind of it did garner kind of international news media, actually. This is a famous tree called the Hadrian Gap sycamore that was located in Northumberland and National Park in England. It was located right along Hadrian's Wall, which is an ancient Roman defensive structure. The tree was estimated to be over 150 years old and one of the most photographed trees in all of the UK. Here's just one iconic kind of photograph of it here on the right. Unfortunately, in 2023, this tree was felled in an act of vandalism, and there wasn't really clear what the motive was initially, but many people speculate it was just to get attention. There were actually 2 people convicted of this crime and charged with criminal damages of over the equivalent of over $800,000. So a huge offense, and those 2 people were convicted and sentenced to over 4 years in prison. The tree did survive, but just an example of how these legacy trees might be at risk just from well, survive in the sense that it resprouted, and there's since been propagules, replanted in the area, but it has, just one example of how we do need to be careful when we're discussing these legacy trees and elevating and highlighting them because they are also potential targets for active vandalism like this. Kind of related to that is this, you know, privacy and the associated preservation with preserving the location of many of these trees. Some of these legacy trees that we might discuss are located on private property, and it's really important that we respect the rights and wishes of owners of those trees. Many tree owners with legacy trees do allow for public access, but it's obviously on a case-by-case basis. And many also, wish that those trees remain hidden, to protect the rights of the owner and also the tree itself. One example of that is Hyperion, which is the tallest known living tree in the world, a coast redwood in California. And land managers specifically, have kept this location of this tree a secret to protect it from people who might, want to damage the tree, you know, and so part of, keeping that location secret can also help with preservation. Within Illinois, there is currently no legal protection of legacy trees at the state level. That being said, uh, there may be local ordinances in your location. So especially in northeastern Illinois, around the Chicago area, many municipalities have more intensive tree ordinances, and those may require permitting or evaluation from a city staff before any tree removal or work can be done. So those potentially could be, legally binding obligations for tree protection, but typically, in many cases, tree protection and or removal is at the discretion of property or tree owners. So really the programs that we discuss that we will focus on implementing are, really recognition programs, and they do necessitate the, participation and willingness of tree owners to work together in protecting these valuable resources of legacy trees. So now I'm going to get into a couple of specific examples that I wanted to highlight in the central Illinois region. So I'm located in Champaign-Urbana, and these are just some of the trees that I'm also more familiar with as far as kind of high, you know, really impressive legacy trees that we have here in the state of Illinois. But this is also just, to get you to think about legacy trees in your area. I've seen, some folks in the chat mentioning specific trees that they're interested in, legacy trees in their area. And this is really to encourage you to go out and look for specific examples in your area as well that you can research and highlight and appreciate. So the first of these examples is one that was called the Last Prairie Sentinel. So this is a white oak located near Springfield, Illinois. It's on a private property in a farmer's pasture. And this is what is considered a trail tree or a pathfinder tree of indigenous peoples who lived on the landscape before European settlement. This specific tree and many, all pathfinder trees, really, there's a set of specific, kind of qualifications that need to be met to be able to ensure that it's a true trail tree or pathfinder tree. And one of those is obviously its age. If it's not old enough to have existed on landscape before European settlement, then the chances of being a trail tree are much, much lower. But this specific tree, is one that the owners, the farmers who manage it, have really shown dedication towards managing. They actually installed a prop under this leaning tree. You can see how this tree is kind of off, the weight is off center, and so they installed a support or a prop underneath the tree to try and support it. That's not really shown in this picture here. Unfortunately, even with that additional care, this tree did fail, though, in 2008. There's actually a derecho. So as I mentioned earlier, those extreme climate events can be really dangerous to these trees. A derecho came along and blew this tree right over. It does exist, though, in nursery stock. So some samples some scion was actually grafted onto nursery stock, and this tree kind of, the genetics of it at least exist longer term through those nursery stock trees. And there's actually been one tree planted nearby where the existing remains of this tree are as well. So just an interesting story that we have here in Central Illinois, and a really unique legacy tree that we can appreciate. Our second example here is a bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, located near Urbana, Illinois. This one's known as the Telford oak, named after a forester from who worked on the 1920s on mapping a lot of the area around Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, in a forest remnant that's called the Big Grove. This is an old growth pre-settlement forest that small remnants still exist of, and many of these old trees, these legacy trees, are evidence of that older Big Grove. So here's an image of this specific tree in 1925. There is somebody standing down there by at the base of it. It's kind of faint and hard to make out, but about 100 years later, this tree still stands in the same forest, and you can visit it today. Um, it is though on University of Illinois property, so it's not necessarily open to the general public. This is a tree, though, within these woods that was purchased in 1939, and really it came down to the dedication of a family member who owned that land ahead of the university, and also a faculty member here, Shelford, who really advocated for preserving this portion of the Big Grove, including this tree, for teaching and research purposes. So again, kind of a story about the preservation of these forests and trees coming down to the commitment of just a handful of people. So kind of highlights what some people can do to assist in preserving legacy trees and forests as well. And this tree is estimated to be over 400 years old, and it's still maintained by University of Illinois staff within this preserve. So very interesting legacy tree that's really close here to campus. The third tree, and one that I was excited to learn more about, is one called the Giant Oak, which is in Giant Oak Park in Peoria, Illinois. This is potentially one of the oldest oaks within the state of Illinois, between 300 and 500 years old. It was also designated as what's called a bicentennial tree in 1976 by the International Society of Arboriculture. So that's a tree that was existed before 1776, the U.S. independence, and so that was kind of a program highlighting a lot of these legacy trees that showed extreme old age like that. It also has an entire park, an entire 1 acre park dedicated to it here in Peoria. You can see that the park district has gone to extreme lengths to protect the tree using different props and struts. The entire canopy of the tree is also fenced in to protect it and prevent soil compaction, etc. So that's they've gone to extreme lengths to preserve this legacy tree, which is really interesting example to see in the middle of the state. So if you're ever in Peoria, I highly recommend visiting this tree in Giant Oak Park. And the last example that I wanted to share is not necessarily a single tree, but a group of white oak trees that exists in the White Oak or in Oak Ridge Cemetery near Springfield, Illinois. These are several individuals of white oak that date back to the 1840s, pre-Civil War era, and these are trees that after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, these trees would have been just in their teens or 20s when Lincoln was assassinated, and his tomb was built among these trees in the cemetery here. So really interesting part of history. You can see trees, where Lincoln's tomb, adjacent to where Lincoln's tomb lies, and some of these trees were used as kind of the model for our state tree when in the 70s, when the white oak was declared our Illinois state tree. Within this group, some of these trees have though succumbed to certain external factors that I mentioned. Uh, I actually showed a picture earlier with a large stump, and that was one of these trees that had been killed by lightning. And so there are, kind of even just um, accidental occurrences that can happen to that can kill some of these legacy trees very quickly. All right, so moving on from those specific examples of a couple different legacy trees, I wanted to now share kind of what we can do, as individuals or community members to participate and support some of these legacy trees. I'm going to go through several different examples of management techniques here next that are specifically kind of suited for legacy trees and older mature trees. But I just wanted to mention right off the bat, participating in our local urban forest activities, whether that's, on a local tree board that we might have as part of our city or town, that can be really impactful and, sharing our interest in preserving those legacy trees, especially in that context, can be very valuable at the local level. If your town doesn't have necessarily a tree board or a tree ordinance, it can be, really valuable to try and encourage the adoption of some of those practices. Related to that, we have what's called a Tree City USA program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that program encourages and supports urban forestry initiatives that can do a lot for protecting all trees, but especially these legacy trees in our areas. Might even consider joining your local tree commission and or at least joining in on the meetings, which should be open to the public and advocating for your legacy trees. And like I said, the next kind of component here is going to be discussing different management practices that we can use that are specifically suited to legacy tree management or mature tree management. Again, just really quick, the having tree care or preservation ordinances is really important. Like I said, at the state level, we don't necessarily have any protections for any trees, but including legacy trees. But sometimes at the local level, these tree ordinances can help govern the management and or removal of both privately and publicly owned trees. Not necessarily advocating for adding for privately owned tree laws, but it is something that some communities do consider. And along with this, I think really every tree ordinance should be specifically designed to meet the needs of different communities. There's also resources available from the Morton Arboretum, including templates and potentially assistance for Illinois communities who are interested in developing their own set of tree ordinances. So I'll have a link here later on in the presentation if you're interested in that. All right, now moving on towards discussing some of these different management techniques for legacy trees specifically. There are, a lot of these practices are applicable to, tree care in general and to taking care of any tree. But there are some specific considerations that we want to take for legacy trees in particular. One of those, at a broad level is just kind of the duration and the impactfulness of certain practices, even if it's something like mulching, considering, how quickly we're changing an environment around a tree that may or may not be suited to very specific conditions. So yeah, if you're looking at doing any management with legacy trees especially, consider taking it very slow and potentially doing it in several different iterations to spread out the impact on that tree and give it some time to adapt. There's also, potentially different cost benefit analysis for managing these legacy trees as compared to your average tree because of those, considerable benefits that they do provide us, whether it's cultural or other measurable benefits, like energy benefits or stormwater runoff, etc. So we might take more extreme or costly management interventions, um, for these specific trees because of that. And I think it's definitely worthwhile in investing in these legacy trees to to ensure that they last for hundreds of more years potentially. There are also considerations that we want to think about, between urban and rural areas. There's different challenges that we might face in both of these contexts. Um, so in urban areas, for example, we might be facing, constrictions within the site or more more commonly construction activities that might affect the root zone of those trees. Uh, Conversely, in rural areas, we might have to consider our adjacent land uses more carefully, whether that's, from plowing or soil cultivation or even things like herbicide drift, which we've discussed here in the past. For example, this is a Illinois champion pin oak that I measured last year, and this is adjacent to a farm field, and we have to. If you're thinking about managing this tree, the cultivation that might occur in this adjacent field, potentially could impact the root zone of this tree, having very adverse consequences. So, just specific things to consider based on the context. All right. I'm going to talk now about some more specific techniques and considerations for management. And this is still just going to be at a very broad level, but just giving you an idea of how these might differ when we're talking about general tree management versus legacy trees. Um, the first thing that I'll mention is pruning. There's a couple different kind of pruning techniques or schemes that we can consider that can benefit legacy trees especially well. The first is what's called a reduction pruning. So oftentimes this can help us address structural issues. If we're thinking about a legacy tree that has extensive cavities or splits or cracks within the stem or branches, these reduction pruning methods, which basically uh, help, can reduce weight on the end of branches by cutting back to a branch that's at least a third of the diameter of the size that we're cutting off. These can help reduce some of that stress, some of that loading on those outside branches, and potentially help reduce the risk of failure as well. Um, I also mentioned earlier retrenchment with gave you all that definition. There's also some pruning techniques called retrenchment pruning, and that is pruning techniques specifically aimed at kind of reducing, again, similar to reduction pruning, reducing the outer portions of the canopy. But in this case, the overall goal is focused more on um, improving kind of an internal and lower canopy development to allow that tree to support itself further into the future. This is not really a structural technique, and there's a lot of debate among arborists. If I have any arborists in the audience and you have opinions on a retrenchment pruning, I would be interested in hearing your opinions about that. There's some techniques, especially more commonly employed in Europe, um, with different cuts that can be quite controversial. So if you have any opinions, please share those in the chat. We might also, with legacy trees, consider leaving things like deadwood for ecological purposes, which can, like I mentioned earlier, have significant ecological value. And especially in legacy trees where we're looking at kind of more long-term management, that might be something we can consider. We also use techniques like cabling and bracing more often in these high value or legacy trees. Um, these are, essentially supporting the branches or stems with different rods or cables that can either be static, as in non-moving, or they can be dynamic, so allow some movement while still supporting those branches. And this can help us reduce the need for some of that reduction pruning, which can be quite impactful in the tree, while still addressing some structural concerns that we might have related to cracks or breaks or cavities in the stem. Here's an example of um, an elm tree with a significant split in the branch, and you can see that it's being supported by some of these cables and bracing right here. They also, within legacy tree management, use what are called props and struts. So these are essentially just props that are secured to the ground, to a branch or a component of the stem, often used on downward growing or horizontal branches. And on our legacy trees especially, we might have very significant lateral or downward facing branches that need additional support, especially if we're in a public area where we might have risk of targets nearby. And so having these props or struts can assist us in, maintaining or handling risk, minimizing risk, but also, supporting the overall structure of the tree. And this is, more commonly practiced, and many of these are more commonly practiced in Europe for different legacy trees they have there. This is an example of a over 600-year-old oak tree in Poland, with extensive props and struts supporting its canopy. Like I mentioned, lightning can be a significant risk to many of our legacy trees, and so lightning protection systems, which are essentially grounding rods for our trees, can be really valuable, especially for these high value trees. Uh, when lightning strikes a tree, it can essentially boil some of the water or sap in those tissues and explode the tissues, as you see has happened in this picture here on the right. So, potentially devastating for any tree. And especially in these legacy trees, it can be worthwhile to protect them with such a system. Mulching is, really common and, um, one of the uh, what I consider the initial steps toward improving soil conditions. So mulching is not necessarily an end all. It's not, the final step that we might take, but it's a great, um, tech management technique that we can use to help us improve soil structure, increase water retention, and also organic matter content in the soil, which can all, be greatly beneficial for mature trees, especially. When we're mulching, we want to try and stick with organic materials, things like leaf litters. So leaf litters of the tree species itself can be some of the best mulch material that we can use, but also hardwood mulches, chipped mulches can be a great alternative. We also have some considerations, just like with any other tree, keeping the mulch fairly thin, about 2 or 3 inches in depth, and away from the trunk as well, and avoiding those volcanoes, something always to mention. For legacy trees, that might be facing things like soil compaction after construction activities, etc. We also have specialized tools, one of which is pneumatic soil excavation using what's called an air spade to use compressed air to essentially remove soil around those roots. And thinking, well, in this case, but really with any of these techniques, think about the potential damage that might be inflicted on a tree. There's some debate as to whether or not this is really a good practice to use, even for mature trees, but in certain situations, it can help alleviate compaction and other conditions. We might also consider supplemental watering for mature trees, legacy trees especially, under very certain conditions, to reduce drought stress or construction stress following a period of, construction damage. Um, I will mention though that this is not always necessary, and oftentimes when used improperly, irrigation or supplemental watering can actually lead to um, additional problems for a tree. Um, Using something like a drip system or a soaker hose is often going to be preferable to a sprinkler or the like, and keeping that water generally in the drip line zone and away from the trunk is going to be really important as well. Tree protection, in the arboricultural community, we often talk about a tree protection zone in the construction context, which can be really important. But for our legacy trees, it's often, especially for higher, visitation ones, it can often be valuable for us to install something like a permanent protection. So whether that's fencing or some kind of barrier around the tree, ideally around the entire canopy or even beyond, can be huge in preserving and preventing things like soil compaction long term. So here's a really high value tree in Montenegro in Europe, the oldest olive tree in that country. And this is an over 2,000-year-old tree. And you can see that they've gone to great extents here with these concrete barriers surrounding the tree to preserve it long term. And another example here in Illinois would be that giant oak park that I mentioned in Peoria. They've got not a concrete fence, but a fence surrounding the entire canopy to ensure the long-term preservation of that tree. All right, so near the end of the presentation here, I just want to kind of highlight some different programs that are related to tree preservation and some more to legacy trees specifically. Just wanted to highlight some of these. and have a discussion about them. The first of which is, again, I mentioned earlier, our Tree City USA program. So this is managed by the Illinois DNR Urban and Community Forestry Division. It's a free membership to any communities who want to join. There's only 4 requirements, which are, having a tree board or department, having a tree care ordinance system in place, and there's, again, various levels that can meet the different needs of specific communities, and then spending a certain amount per capita on tree work within your community, and finally proclaiming Arbor Day. So if any of you, live in a community where you are interested in doing some of this, or maybe are already doing this, joining a Tree City USA program can be huge. There's resources and support that can be offered to assist your urban forestry initiatives. So just one thing I wanted to shout out among our urban forestry and legacy tree specific programs. The next I wanted to highlight is a legacy tree program that's actually here in Urbana and one of the few across the state. This was a program started in 2013 that celebrates the most significant trees in the city, and really any resident can nominate a tree. It's a voluntary program where, again, the tree owners will also consent to having their tree listed within the program. Uh, but there is some level of kind of at the city level, there is some evaluation that's done by the city arborist, and then the tree commission will uh, also accept a tree. And so trees that join this program, are eligible for receiving free mulch from the city, also potentially advice from the city arborists, and a certificate of recognition. So a really interesting program, and one that, helps just kind of highlight and recognize high value trees within the city. Similarly, there's a legacy tree program that's run by the Natural Land Institute in Northern Illinois, kind of in the Rockford region. And this is one that kind of works within the 12 county region in Northern Illinois. It highlights trees based on their size, but also cultural heritage. And, it intends to highlight specifically locally native trees. They also have, monthly highlights, and they're building a register of legacy trees within that area. So if you're within the Northern Illinois region and have a legacy tree in mind, in your area, you might think about submitting it to this program. We also have the Illinois Big Tree Registry Program, the Champion Tree Program, which is, again, one that I coordinate. This started in 1962, specifically looking at Illinois' largest native trees, but many of which have other cultural values, and I would consider legacy trees as well. This is one that anyone can nominate, so I encourage you all, if you have some large trees, to consider nominating them to our program. And we continually maintain and update this with new submissions. I'd also like to shout out Union County for having the highest density of champion trees. There's a little bit of a internal competition between some counties. So if you are interested in this program, I'd say there's lots of big trees still out there to be found. So go ahead and please find them and send them to us. Similarly, there's also a national champion tree program. So this is one that was started in the 1940s, again, looking at the largest specifically specimen trees of mostly native trees. It doesn't necessarily track all legacy trees, but again, I'd consider most of the champion trees to be legacy trees in their own right. This is one now managed by the University of Tennessee School of Natural Resources. And from Illinois, we've got 2 current national champions from the 2024 registry. I believe we've probably got more national champions than that just waiting out there to be found. This was a previous national champion that we had in Illinois, a huge Shumard oak, over 105 inches in diameter. It has since passed away, and it is no longer listed as a state or national champion, unfortunately. So along those lines too, if you have a large Shumard oak in mind, we're looking for a new state champion. But this was a really impressive tree, and one that I think a lot of people will remember for a long time. Another program I wanted to highlight here just towards the end is a program that's primarily in Europe. It's actually a certification program for managing what is called in Europe veteran trees, which have a lot of similarities to legacy trees. There's actually a specific certification program in Europe for managing these trees, that focuses on kind of the nuances of pruning and other management techniques for these legacy trees specifically. Many of these practices are kind of beyond the normal scope of what people might consider, for managing an average tree again. There's also various levels of certifications within this program. So there's a level for practicing and another for consulting arborists, which kind of focus on different areas of management. Currently, there's not really any kind of comparable program here within the United States, but there are other, resources and materials provided by groups like the International Society of Arboriculture and the Association of Consulting Arborists, which can assist with managing these trees specifically, and some of the things we talked about today. Finally, I wanted to kind of mention, like, looking forward towards the future of legacy trees in Illinois. There's actually been public legislation passed through the Illinois Congress, state Congress, or the state house that you know, establishes a legacy tree program task force. And the goal of this is to, create a program eventually that will support and the identification, awareness, and commemoration of our most significant trees in the state. So really exciting. There's some work happening at the state level going towards recognizing these legacy trees, like we discussed today, and moving forward into the future. Hopefully, there will be a statewide program to recognize and highlight the benefits of these specific trees. All right, so kind of summarizing here at the end, we've talked a lot about different examples of legacy trees and looked at how they have many different names and different forms. We've also talked about some of the cultural and ecological and even economic benefits of these trees, some of the threats, that they face, specific to legacy trees, but really some to all trees in general. We discussed how there's not really currently any legal protections, but tree ordinances and the like can be a good option for that if needed, based on the community level. There's lots of different legacy trees across the landscape, and they don't always receive necessarily the management that they require to persist as long as they possibly could. And we've also talked about some ways, and techniques that we can use or consider to, or advocate for, at least for managing legacy trees in our area and even implementing ourselves if we have that opportunity. So just at the end here, if you have any issues related to legacy trees, please always feel free to reach out to us, the Extension Foresters. There's also DNR district foresters or consulting arborists or certified arborists who are there to help you. Here's just some resources that I mentioned throughout the talk if you want to look further into them, some of the studies that I reference. And now I've got about 5 minutes left for questions if anybody has them.